Warsaw, February 17th, 2023. The body of a 68-year-old man was found in an upscale apartment on Puławska Street. 2 gunshot wounds to the head. The Polish police ruled it a suicide and closed the case within a week. But in the criminal underworld, they knew the truth. TEIMURAZ Jalagania, the legendary Chinchlia, had not merely been killed. He had been erased. A thief-in-law with his record, a man who had survived 2 coronations and 2 de-coronations, does not commit suicide. This was a cleanup job. The only question: who dared raise a hand against a man that even the wild 90s had been too afraid to touch? To understand the ending of this story, one must go back to the beginning. To the Batumi of the 70s, when the Black Sea washed not only the beaches of vacationers, but also the harshest criminal capital in all of the Soviet Union. A city where the criminal code meant more than a party membership card, where a single word spoken out of turn could cost you your life, and where the crown of a thief-in-law was given only to those who had passed through fire, water, and the hell of the prison camp. TEIMURAZ Jalagania was born in 1955 into an ordinary Batumi family. His father worked as a port dock worker. His mother sold goods at the market. Nothing criminal, ordinary Soviet life. But at the age of 13, Taiko, as the boys from the neighborhood called him, ended up in the juvenile police unit for the first time. He had stolen a wallet from a visitor from Tbilisi at the bazaar. A trifle, it seemed. But it was there, in the detention cell, that the young boy first heard the true criminal code from the older inmates. By 14, he was already one of the local street gang. At 15, he got his first sentence: 2 years in a juvenile colony for theft. A minor, but there, in the camp, TEIMURAZ showed his character. He didn't become a snitch, didn't run to the wardens to inform, held his place by the code. The elders took notice. And in the criminal world, when the elders notice a young man, that's already half the road to authority. He was released at 17 and immediately plunged back into crime. Batumi in the 70s was not the resort town shown in Soviet films. Behind the facade of sanatoriums and palm trees, real life was boiling. The port was the main gateway for smuggling. Turkey across the sea, Georgian wine, citrus fruits, and above all, the trade in scarce goods. Jeans, cosmetics, tape recorders, everything flowed through Batumi. And all these flows were controlled by the criminal den. By the age of 20, Jalagania was already a name people knew. Daring robberies, clean work, no slip-ups. He didn't take random jobs, he planned every move. Hence the nickname, Chinchlia, meaning the daring one in Georgian. The story behind the nickname is told in different ways, but the most famous version involves the Tbilisi train station. 1976. TEIMURAZ is 21. He and his crew plan to rob the station's cash register. A risky job. Cops nearby, guards, crowds everywhere. Any sensible thief would say, "Don't do it, you'll get burned." But Jalagania walks into the cashier's booth in broad daylight during rush hour when there's a mob of people. He pulls out a gun, makes the cashier hand over the money. 5 minutes, and he's already on the street. He dissolved into the crowd as if nothing had happened. The police turned the whole city upside down but couldn't catch him. Airtight alibi, no witnesses, all traces covered. When this story was recounted at a gathering, one of the old thieves said, "This boy is Chinchlia, a truly daring one." The nickname stuck for good. From that point on, everyone knew TEIMURAZ by no other name. But daring is one thing, and authority in the criminal world is something else entirely. You can be a brave robber
and remain an ordinary street thug your whole life. The crown of a thief-in-law is not given for courage.
It's earned through a life lived by the code, through loyalty to the criminal law, through respect in prison and on the outside. And here a man appeared in Jalagania's fate without whom this entire story would never have happened. Zurab Tsintsadze, Zuri of Batumi, a name that in the criminal world of Transcaucasia rang like both a sentence and a blessing. Born in 1925, he received his first sentence at 16. He passed through Stalin's labor camps, Khrushchev's prison zones, Brezhnev's jails. Crowned in 1952, at the very height of the criminal traditions, when the code was iron and traitors were cut down without a word, Zuri was a legend. They said he had never raised his hand against the weak, that he shared the communal fund with those in need, that even the cops respected him, not for bribes, but for his integrity. In the criminal world, he was called Robin Hood, though Tsintsadze himself could not stand the comparison. "I'm a thief, not a hero from a book," he would reply. But the fact remains. Zuri of Batumi crowned 18 thieves-in-law. 18. That is an absolute record, unbroken by anyone to this day. Each coronation followed all the rules: a gathering, witnesses, a review of the candidate's biography. Tsintsadze did not bestow the crown just like that, out of favoritism or for money. He looked into the soul, and if he saw even a trace of a rat, he refused outright. In the late 70s, the paths of Zuri and TEIMURAZ crossed. By that time, Jalagania had already served his second sentence, 3 years for armed robbery. In the camp, he held to the code, didn't snitch, earned authority. He was released in 1979 and immediately returned to Batumi. The city welcomed him as its own. Zuri heard about the young thief and wanted to see him. The meeting took place in one of Batumi's restaurants, in a closed room where only the right people gathered. Tsintsadze sat at the head of the table, with other figures of authority beside him. Jalagania entered, greeted everyone according to the code, and sat down. They say Zuri tested him for 3 hours. He asked questions about the camp, about jobs, about life. He listened to the answers and looked into his eyes. And then he said, "You're a straight-up young man, Chinchlia. You'll walk alongside me. Learn. Maybe you'll grow into a crown." For a 24-year-old, this was like a blessing from God. Zuri of Batumi did not give out such words left and right. From that day, Jalagania became close to Tsintsadze. Not as a lackey, no. By the code, that would have been a humiliation for a thief. More like a student. Zuri passed on his knowledge, taught him the right way to live, explained the criminal law. TEIMURAZ absorbed it all like a sponge. But in Batumi there was another serious player, Arsen Kaidze, known as Arsen of Batumi. A thief-in-law since 1968, a hard and ambitious man. If Zuri was the old school, then Arsen was a new formation. He had no qualms working with black marketeers, took money from underground factory bosses, controlled shadow businesses. Formally, this did not violate the code. A thief can oversee dealings and take a cut. But the style was different. Between Zuri and Arsen, there was an unspoken rivalry. Not a war, no. Open conflict was in nobody's interest. But two different concepts of the criminal life were constantly colliding. Tsintsadze adhered to the old rules. A thief doesn't work, lives off the communal fund and from jobs, helps his own, keeps his standing. Chikaidze believed that times were changing and one had to adapt. Extort protection money from businesses, invest, expand. Jalagania found himself between two fires. He respected Zuri as his teacher and godfather, but he saw that Arsen was no fool either.
Money was flowing, influence was growing. In the early 80s, this choice was not yet pressing, but soon everything would change. 1982. TEIMURAZ Jalagania is 27 years old.
Behind him, 3 sentences: a decade in crime, an iron authority, and the blessing of Zuri of Batumi. Chinchlia decides, it's time to crown Chinchlia. A gathering is called. Thieves in law arrive from Tbilisi, Kutaisi, Sukhumi. They review TEIMURAZ's biography. He's clean. Never worked a state job, never served in the military, never informed. His sentences are all correct, covered by the thief's statute. In the camp, he held to the code. The vote was unanimous. TEIMURAZ Jalagania received the crown. He became a thief in law. At 27, young but not unheard of. The main thing was that he had earned it. Zuri personally conducted the ceremony, placed a ring on Chinchlia's finger, and embraced him. "Now you are my brother under the law," he said. "Keep your standing. Don't lower the title." Jalagania kept it. The first year after the coronation passed peacefully. He oversaw his territory, helped young thieves, attended gatherings. His authority grew. It seemed everything was going to plan, but in the criminal world, plans break quickly. 1983. A year after the coronation, something happened that no one expected. TEIMURAZ Jalagania was decrowned. His title of thief-in-law was stripped. The official reason given was violation of the criminal code. But exactly what Chinchlia had violated was never clearly explained. The gathering was closed, and the details were not disclosed. Rumors spread through the criminal world. Some said Jalagania had not divided the communal fund properly. Others said he was tangled up in some shady deal with the police. Still others whispered that it was all politics between Zuri and arson, and that Chinchlia had simply been caught in the crossfire. TEIMURAZ himself stayed silent. By the code, a decrowned thief cannot publicly defend himself. That would be shameful. He accepted the gathering's decision, removed his ring, and walked away. But the bitterness remained.
And the question? What for?
The most plausible version is connected directly to the confrontation between the 2 Batumi patriarchs. By 1983, the conflict between Zuri Batumsky and Arsen Chinchlia had sharpened. Chinchlia had begun actively promoting his own people, crowned several young thieves, expanded his influence. Zuri didn't like this. He saw that the new generation was departing from the old code, chasing money instead of honor. Jalagania was Zuri's protege, and when Arsen decided to weaken Chinchlia's position, he struck at his student. At the 1983 gathering, representatives of Arsen's faction brought charges against Chinchlia. Allegedly, he had mishandled the communal fund, made decisions without coordination. There were no real witnesses, only words, but there were enough votes. Zuri could not protect his protege, or chose not to, rather than split the criminal world with open conflict. He stayed silent. And TEIMURAZ was decrowned. For Jalagania, this was a blow. He had lost the crown, but his street authority remained. Thieves who knew him personally continued to respect him, but formally, he was no longer a thief-in-law, just an authoritative criminal. The next 10 years, Chinchlia spent in the shadows. He did not leave crime. He continued working, but without the crown. In 1985, he was locked up again, 4 years for robbery. He served until 1989. He was released into a different country. The USSR was cracking at the seams. Perestroika was underway. The old order was collapsing. And in Batumi, changes were also happening. Zuri Batumsky was aging, his health failing.
Arsen Chaidze was consolidating his position, but even he understood times were changing. New people and new approaches were needed. And here an unexpected turn occurred. 1991. The Soviet Union is falling apart. Georgia declares independence.
The country plunges into chaos. War in Abkhazia, criminal feuds, redistribution of property. The criminal world was also experiencing a transformation. The old authorities were either stepping down or adapting to the new realities. Zuri Batumsky in 1991 was already a very old man by criminal world standards. 66 years old, his health nearly gone. He understood that he would be leaving soon and wanted to leave the right people behind him. And then he remembered TEIMURAZ JALAGANIA. Batumsky invited Chinchlia to a meeting. They sat alone, without witnesses. What they spoke about is unknown, but after that meeting, Zuri began assembling a gathering for Jalagania's re-coronation. This was an unprecedented case. A de-crowned thief-in-law had practically never been re-crowned. This went against the code. If the title was stripped, it was stripped forever. But Zuri insisted. He argued that in 1983, the decrowning had been unjust, that Chinchlia had not violated the code, that it had been a political game. Arsen Chaidze was against it. But by that time, his influence had weakened. Some of his people had been killed in feuds. Others had gone into business. Zuri, despite his age, still commanded enormous respect among the old guard. The gathering took place in 1992. Thieves gathered from across Georgia and neighboring republics. Zuri gave a speech and explained the situation. The vote was tense, but the majority agreed. TEIMURAZ JALAGANIA received the crown of thief-in-law for the second time. This was a unique moment in the history of the criminal world. A man who had lost his title had reclaimed it 10 years later. Nothing like it had occurred before, and nothing like it has occurred since. Jalagania was once again Chinchlia, the daring thief-in-law. And this time, no one would take the crown from him while he still lived. Zuri Batumsky died in 1993. His funeral drew hundreds of people, thieves, authority figures, ordinary people he had helped. Chinchlia carried his godfather's coffin. They say he wept openly, without shame. He had lost not just a teacher, he had lost a father by the code. After Zuri's death, Jalagania became one of the main figures of authority in Batumi. Arsen Chaidze had by then stepped back from criminal affairs, focusing on business. The criminal world of Georgia was entering a new era, the era of the 90s, when thieves-in-law were becoming businessmen and bandits were becoming politicians. Chinchlia tried to hold to the old code, but reality dictated its own terms. Either adapt or step away. He chose the former. He began overseeing legitimate businesses, investing in real estate, building connections with the new Georgian elite. In the 90s, Jalagania became the subject of several criminal investigations, but avoided serious sentences. Either his connections helped, or he simply had luck on his side. In 1998, he was arrested on suspicion of organizing the murder of a competing businessman, but the case fell apart. Witnesses withdrew their statements. By the early 2000s, Chinchlia was no longer the daring young man of the 70s. He was approaching 50, gray-haired, overweight, with health problems, but his authority remained. Young thieves came to him for advice, old ones came for support. Georgia was also changing. The Rose Revolution in 2003, the arrival of Saakashvili, the crackdown on crime.
The new government began pressing hard on thieves in law. Many were arrested, many were pushed out of the country. Jalagania felt the ground shifting under his feet. In 2005, he left Georgia, first to Turkey, then to Russia, then to Europe. He drifted, searching for somewhere he could live in peace. But for a man with his biography, a peaceful life does not exist. The past always catches up. In Russia, Chinchlia tried to establish connections with local thieves, but times had changed.
The Russian criminal world, after Putin's crackdowns of the 2000s, had become a different place. The old criminal code had blurred, state power had tightened. Jalagania was not particularly welcome there, an outsider from Georgia, even one with a crown. He returned to Europe. He lived in Poland, the Czech Republic, Germany. He changed apartments, documents, phones. He was paranoid, and for good reason. The criminal world remembered him, and not all the memories were warm ones. By the late 2000s, Jalagania had effectively stepped back from operations. He lived off accumulated savings, occasionally gave advice to young thieves by telephone, but played no active role. His health was deteriorating: diabetes, heart problems, high blood pressure. Old age was taking its toll. But even in this condition, he remained a figure. A thief in law cannot simply retire. It is not a profession, it is a lifelong status. And all debts, all grudges, all scores stretch on for years. In 2020, the pandemic began. Jalagania was stranded in Warsaw. Poland closed its borders, movement became difficult. He rented an apartment in a quiet neighborhood, lived quietly, barely went out. It seemed he had found his refuge. But in February 2023, they found him. Who exactly? Unknown. The Polish police didn't put in much effort to investigate. A dead Georgian criminal authority was of no interest to them. They wrote "suicide" and closed the case. The criminal world knew the truth. Chinchlia had been taken out. Versions abound. Some say old scores from the 90s. Others, a conflict with young thieves who didn't like the old man interfering in their affairs. Still others, a contract hit from Russia or Georgia, where someone had a very deep grudge against him. No evidence exists for any version. There's only a body with 2 bullets in the head, and a legend now growing with myths. TEIMURAZ JALAGANIA, Chinchlia, the daring one, lived a life like something out of a film. 2 crowns, 2 de-coronations, decades in crime and in prison, hundreds of jobs, thousands of stories, and a final act in a foreign country, in a rented apartment, lying in a pool of blood. That's the romance of the criminal life, stripped of any illusion. To understand why Chinchlia ended up in Warsaw with a bullet in his head, one must return to that very year of 1983, to the de-crowning that overturned his life. The official version, a violation of the code. But what code precisely the 28-year-old thief had violated, no one ever clearly explained. And in the criminal world, where every decision is justified by the iron logic of the law, such a murky formulation always means one thing: politics. Batumi in the early 80s was not just a city. It was the criminal Mecca of the Caucasus, a place of power where the fates of authority figures from Tbilisi to Baku were decided. And at the center of this world stood 2 men, 2 poles, 2 philosophies: Zuri Batumsky and Arsen Chkhaidze. Old guard versus new formation, tradition versus progress, honor versus money. Zuri of Batumi, by the early 80s, was already an old man by criminal world standards. 57 years old, over 30 of them spent as a thief in law.
He had passed through Stalin's labor camps when the criminal code was still being formed. He had seen the times when a violation of the code meant being cut down without trial. He knew the era of the true thieves, those who never held a state job, never served, and lived only off the communal fund and from their jobs. Chinchlia was an ascetic. He lived modestly, wore simple clothing, did not show off gold. Money for him was a tool, not a goal. The communal fund he spent on helping prisoners, supporting the families of fallen thieves, and meeting the needs of the criminal fraternity. He himself made do with little. They said he could sleep on a bare floor and eat bread with water if circumstances demanded it.
But this did not mean Zuri was weak or a saint. He had passed through things that young thieves couldn't even dream of. In the 50s, when the criminal world was experiencing the split between thieves and snitches, Chinchlia held to his own line against any cooperation with the administration. Several times they tried to bend him, intimidate him, break him. It didn't work. He held firm and earned the reputation of an Iron Man. 18 coronations. That is not just a number. It is 18 fates, 18 lives for which Zuri bore responsibility. He personally vetted each candidate, sometimes for years. He looked not only at their deeds, but at their soul. A thief-in-law for Chinchlia was not merely a title, it was a calling. A man had to be ready to die for the code, not to trade it for profit. One of his protégés, crowned in the 70s, later recalled, "Zuri tested me for 3 years. He asked about the camp, about jobs, about family. Once he deliberately sent a young man who offered to set up a deal with the cops, said there was money to be made. I refused and told him to get lost. Later I found out it had been a test. Zuri used to say, if you ever think about cooperating with the authorities, you're no longer a thief, you're a rat." This approach did not appeal to everyone. In the criminal world of the early 80s, changes were already brewing. The younger generation looked at things more pragmatically. The Soviet Union was rotting, and the deficit economy was creating enormous opportunities for profit. Black marketeering, speculation, underground factory bosses, all of it revolved around money. And many thieves began to understand that one could live not only off the communal fund, but also off business by controlling the shadow economy. Arsen Chikadze was a representative of exactly this new thinking. Crowned in 1968, 12 years after Zuri, but already with a different worldview. He had lived through Khrushchev's thaw, Brezhnev's stagnation, and seen how the country was changing, and he understood that the old methods no longer worked. Chikadze was not an enemy of tradition. He respected the criminal law, held to the code, did not snitch. But he believed the law had to adapt to reality. A thief can oversee business, take a percentage from underground factory owners, give protection to speculators. The main thing is not to work himself and not to cooperate with the authorities directly. This is not a violation of the code. It is evolution. By the early 80s, Arsen of Batumi controlled a significant portion of the shadow economy in the city. Through his people flowed goods from Turkey, jeans, cosmetics, electronics. Underground factory owners who illegally sewed clothing or distilled moonshine paid him tribute. Speculators at the markets worked under his protection. Money flowed like a river. Formally, Chikadze did not violate the criminal law. He didn't work himself, didn't snitch, didn't cooperate with the cops. He simply oversaw criminal business and took his share. But the philosophy was different. Zuri saw in this a betrayal of the idea.
A thief should live modestly, help his own, and not grow rich on others' labor. Arson believed that a thief should be strong and influential, and for that, money and connections were necessary. Two approaches, two truths, and between them, an invisible front line passing through the entire Batumi criminal world. Some thieves were drawn to Zuri, others to arson. There was no open conflict, but the tension was growing. TEIMURAZ Jalagania was caught in this grinder at the worst possible moment. He had been crowned by Zuri in 1982, which automatically placed him in Cinsadze's camp. But Chinchlia was young, ambitious, and could see how arson was growing rich and powerful. And somewhere deep down, he wondered, maybe old Zuri is wrong. Maybe one needs to move with the times? These doubts were sensed. In the criminal world, weakness is detected from a mile away. And when arson needed to undercut Cinsadze's position, he struck at Jalagania, at Zuri's youngest and most promising protege. The formal grounds for the decrowning were connected to the communal fund. It was said that Chinchlia had not coordinated with the other thieves in distributing the money, that he had unilaterally decided who would receive what. In the criminal world, the communal fund is sacred. It can only be dispensed collectively, at a gathering. If a thief decided on his own, without asking, that is a serious violation. But the details were murky. How much money, to whom it was given, why he hadn't asked. All of this remained off the record. At the 1983 gathering, representatives of Arson's faction brought the accusation. There were no witnesses, only words. Zuri could have defended Chinchlia, used his authority to press for a detailed investigation. But he stayed silent. Why? Several versions exist. The first, Zuri genuinely believed that Jalagania had made a mistake, however minor, and that the punishment was just. The second, the old man was tired of fighting, realized he couldn't win an open conflict with arson, and chose to sacrifice his student to preserve the peace. The third, he was testing Chinchlia, wanting to see how he would handle the blow. Which version is true? Unknown. Jalagania himself never discussed the details. By the code, a decrowned thief must accept the decision in silence and not complain. Chinchlia accepted. He removed his ring, left the gathering, and vanished. The bitterness remained. Not toward the criminal law, the law is the law. Bitterness toward the people, toward arson who had set him up, toward the witnesses who had stayed silent, and perhaps toward Zuri, who had not protected him.
The years that followed, Jalagania spent in a state of suspension. Formally, he was no longer a thief-in-law, but his street authority remained. The boys from the neighborhood respected him. Old friends offered support. He continued working, but without the crown, without the right to vote at gatherings, without the status. In 1985, he was locked up again. 4 years for organizing the robbery of a jewelry store in Tbilisi. The case was high profile. The police got on his trail quickly. Chinchlia could have slipped away, gone underground, but he didn't. He turned himself in, took the blame, and did not give up his accomplices. In the camp, he held to the code, did not lose his authority. He was released in 1989. The USSR was cracking at the seams. Gorbachev was pushing perestroika. The republics were asserting their rights. The economy was collapsing. In Georgia, national unrest was beginning. Inter-ethnic conflicts, confrontation with Moscow. The criminal world, too, could smell the wind of change. Zuri Cinchlia by that time was already very old. 64 years old, a bad heart, weak legs.
He understood that he was departing and thought about his legacy. He looked at Batumi, at Georgia, at the criminal world, and didn't recognize what he saw. Young thieves were chasing money, forgetting the code, selling their authority. Chinchlia and his people controlled almost all the criminal business, were growing rich, accumulating connections. The old man understood that he had lost. His era was leaving. But he wanted at least to correct one mistake, and he remembered TEIMURAZ JALAGANIA. The meeting took place in 1991. Zuri invited Chinchlia to his home, a modest apartment on the outskirts of Batumi. They sat alone and drank tea. Zuri spoke at length. Jalagania listened in silence. The old man admitted that in 1983 he had acted wrongly, that he had not defended Chinchlia when he could have, that he had sacrificed his student for an illusory peace with arson, and that now he wanted to correct the mistake, to crown TEIMURAZ again and restore his status. Jalagania asked, "What's the point? The times are already different. The people are different." Zuri replied, "The point is that justice must prevail. You did not violate the code. You were decrowned unjustly. I will correct this." Chinchlia agreed, not for the sake of the crown, it no longer held the value it once had, but to close an unresolved matter, to remove the stigma of being a decrowned thief, for inner peace. Zuri began preparing the gathering. This was no easy task. A repeated coronation of a decrowned thief was an unprecedented case. Many thieves were against it. They said it violated tradition, that it created a dangerous precedent. If those who had been decrowned could be brought back, then the decrowning itself would lose its meaning. But Chinchlia insisted. He used all his authority, all his connections, all the debts owed to him over decades. He called thieves across the union, explained the situation, asked for support. Many agreed, not because they believed in Jalagania's innocence, but out of respect for Zuri. The old man was asking for the last time in his life, and refusing him would have been shameful. Chinchlia was categorically against it. For him, Chinchlia's return meant a strengthening of Zuri's position, however symbolic. He tried to block the gathering, pressured his people, sought allies, but his power was not what it had been. In the early 90s, Georgia was sinking into chaos. War in Abkhazia, the overthrow of Gamsakurdia, feuds between clans. Many of Arsen's people had either been killed, fled, or switched their attention to more pressing problems. The gathering took place at the end of 1991 or the beginning of 1992. No one gives an exact date. It was a closed meeting. Thieves gathered from Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Russia. 40 people, perhaps more. Zuri gave a speech. He spoke of justice, of honor, of the need for the criminal law to stand above politics. The vote was tense. Some thieves supported Zuri out of respect. Others, because they genuinely believed Jalagania's decrowning had been unjust. Still others stayed silent, not wanting to get drawn into someone else's conflict. But the majority was for. TEIMURAZ Jalagania received the crown of thief-in-law for the second time. The ring was placed on his finger again. The ceremony was conducted by all the rules. Chinchlia became a unique case in the history of the criminal world, the only man ever crowned twice after a decrowning. Zuri embraced him and said, "Now we are even. I have corrected my mistake. Live on as you see fit." These were his last words to Jalagania as a godfather. Tsintsadze died in 1993. Officially, a heart attack. But in the criminal world, people whispered that the old man had been poisoned. He died too conveniently, in the midst of the Georgian turmoil, at a moment when his authority could have influenced the balance of power. No proof exists, but the rumors remained. The funeral was large. Hundreds of people came. Thieves, authority figures, ordinary citizens. Zuri had helped many people in his lifetime, and people remembered it. Jalagania carried the coffin, wept openly and loudly. He had lost not just a teacher, he had lost the last link to the old world, to the real code. After Zuri's death, Batumi changed for good. Arsen Chikaidze formally remained the main authority, but was already stepping back from affairs. Illness, age, exhaustion. He turned to legitimate business, left crime to the young. He died in the early 2000s, quietly, in his own bed. Jalagania, from 1992 onward, was once again a thief-in-law, but in a different reality.
The Soviet Union had collapsed, Georgia had become independent, and the wild 90s had begun. The criminal world was undergoing transformation. The old code was blurring. New players were appearing. The rules of the game were changing. Chinchlia tried to hold to the traditions that Zuri had taught him. He didn't wade into big politics, didn't extort protection money from government structures, lived by the old rules. But reality dictated different conditions. Around him, a war was raging for property, for resources, for influence. Thieves-in-law were becoming players in this field, whether they wanted to or not. In Georgia in the early 90s, there were several major criminal factions. The Tbilisi one, the Kutaisi one, the Batumi one, the Sukhumi one. Each controlled its own region and its own interests. Jalagania formally belonged to the Batumi faction, but tried to remain neutral. He participated in gatherings, settled disputes, but didn't wade into feuds. This was a delicate game. On one hand, authority required presence. You cannot be a thief-in-law and stand on the sidelines. On the other, getting involved in every conflict meant acquiring enemies. Chinchlia balanced, but it was becoming increasingly difficult. In 1995, an incident occurred that showed how fragile his position had become. In Batumi, a young authority figure connected to Jalagania was killed. The killers worked professionally. 2 shots to the head, vanished without a trace. Rumors spread through the city that the customer was a competing faction from Tbilisi. People expected a reaction from Chinchlia. By the code, if one of your people is killed, you must respond. Either find the one who ordered the hit and punish him, or declare war. But Jalagania stayed silent. He didn't escalate the conflict, didn't search for those responsible. He only said, "We'll sort it out internally, without noise." Many took this as weakness.
Whispers started that Chinchlia wasn't the same anymore, that the crown sat unsteadily on him. Jalagania felt these conversations, but did not react. He understood. A real war would mean a great deal of blood, and it wasn't worth it. Better to lose a little authority than to drown Batumi in feuds. This decision was strategically correct, but it cost him dearly in terms of reputation. From the mid-90s, Chinchlia began losing influence. Not sharply, not all at once, but steadily. He was no longer invited to important gatherings. Young thieves stopped asking for advice. Old friends gradually drifted away. Chinchlia was turning into a ghost of the past, a legend that was still physically alive but already socially dead. He could feel this fading, and it was more agonizing than any physical pain. A thief-in-law without respect is an empty title, a sound without meaning. You can wear the ring, you can call yourself a thief, but if no one listens, you are nothing. In 1998, when Jalagania was accused of organizing the murder of a businessman who had refused to pay tribute, he understood. This was the end. The case was a contract hit. That much was obvious. Someone wanted him removed, sent away for a long sentence, erased from the game. Chinchlia used all his resources to extricate himself, and he did, but the cost was high. He spent money, connections, health. He emerged from this affair a victorious loser, formally acquitted, but in reality, broken. And he understood that staying in Georgia was no longer possible. Too many enemies, too few friends. But even then, he didn't leave right away. He waited another 5 years until the Rose Revolution of 2003. Why? Perhaps he hoped the situation would change. Perhaps he didn't want to run, seeing it as humiliating. Perhaps he was simply exhausted and couldn't bring himself to sever ties with his homeland. When Saakashvili came to power and began cleansing the criminal world, Jalagania understood his time was up.
The new government made no distinctions between thieves and bandits, between the old guard and new factions. Everyone was swept up with the same broom. To sit and wait for arrest was foolish. His departure from Georgia in 2005 was a symbolic ending. Chinchlia was not merely leaving a country, he was leaving an era. He was leaving behind Batumi, where his youth had passed, Zuri, who had long since died, the crown, which had become a burden rather than a source of pride, the criminal world, which had turned into a business. Turkey, Russia, Poland. His wanderings around the world were a search for a home that no longer existed. Jalagania sought a place where he could live out the rest of his life in peace, without looking over his shoulder at the past. But the past caught up with him everywhere. In Russia, he wasn't welcomed. Local thieves looked at him as a stranger, however legendary his biography. The Russian criminal world of the 2000s was rigidly structured and controlled by the state. A Georgian thief-in-law with a complicated reputation was more of a problem than an asset. In Poland, Jalagania finally found peace, not because it was better there, but simply because he was too tired to keep running. Warsaw became the last stop, the final station of a long journey. Here he could be nobody, an ordinary elderly émigré, of whom there are thousands in Poland. The first years in Warsaw passed relatively quietly. Jalagania lived quietly, kept a low profile, had no contact with the criminal world. He had money, his health still held up. He rented an apartment in a decent neighborhood, settled in, started learning Polish. He tried to integrate, but it was difficult. The loneliness weighed on him. Chinchlia had never had a family. A thief-in-law by the old code was not supposed to marry or have children. It was considered a weakness, a distraction from the criminal path. Jalagania had followed this rule his entire life. And now, in old age, he was paying for it with loneliness. He had no friends. Compatriots from the Georgian diaspora kept their distance. They knew his biography and were afraid of associating with him. Neighbors were indifferent. This is Europe, where everyone minds their own business. Doctors saw him once a month, formally, for medical purposes. Jalagania spent much of his time on the internet. He read news from Georgia, watched videos on YouTube, browsed forums where the criminal world was discussed. Sometimes he came across mentions of himself, old stories, legends, speculation. He read and smirked. Half of what was written was untrue, but there was no point in arguing. He kept a blog in Georgian where he wrote about his life, about the criminal code, about how the world had changed. Readership was small, perhaps 50 or 100 people. Young people had no interest in it.
But Jalagania was not writing for an audience. He was writing for himself, to make sense of the life he had lived. In one post written in 2019, he reflected on the meaning of the criminal life. We thought we lived by the code for the sake of honor, but in reality, honor was a justification for violence. We robbed, killed, shattered other people's lives, and called it the criminal law. Then we were surprised that no one respected us, that society feared and hated us. This post drew a negative reaction from his few readers. People wrote that Chinchlia had betrayed the criminal traditions, that he had become a snitch, that he was unworthy of the crown. Jalagania did not respond. He had long since stopped trying to prove anything to anyone. At his age, and with his experience, truth mattered more than reputation. The 2020 pandemic was a severe ordeal for him. Isolation, the impossibility of going outside, the fear of infection. His diabetes and bad heart made COVID a potentially lethal threat. Jalagania spent nearly a year inside his apartment, going out only to the corner shop.
Psychologically, it broke him. Loneliness transformed from background noise into hell. Days merged into one endless gray stream. Morning, pills, news, lunch, a nap, evening, sleep. And so every day, month after month, he began to think about death, not in a depressive sense, but philosophically. He understood that there was little time left. His diabetes was progressing, his heart was giving out, his strength was fading. The doctor said that in his condition, he might last another 5 years, or 1 year, or a month, unpredictable. Jalagania was not afraid of death itself. He had lived a life full of events, had seen both good and bad. What he feared was something else, dying unneeded, in a foreign country, without proper send-off. A thief-in-law should depart with honors, surrounded by his criminal brotherhood, with traditions observed, not die alone in a rented apartment. In 2021, when the pandemic eased somewhat, Jalagania tried to restore connections with the criminal world. He called old acquaintances, wrote in messengers, tried to find out who was still alive, where people were, what was happening. The responses were sparse and formal. Most either didn't remember him or didn't want to be in touch. One old thief, with whom Chinchlia had served time back in the 80s, said it plainly. "TEIMURAZ, you're a good man, but your time has passed. The young don't know you. The old are almost all dead. Live quietly. Don't get involved in affairs. It's safer that way." This was a blow, not because it was offensive, because it was true. Jalagania had genuinely become a ghost, a relic of a departed era. His name still meant something to a narrow circle of old thieves, but to the rest of the criminal world, he was nobody. At the end of 2021, a strange episode occurred. Jalagania was visited by a man who introduced himself as a journalist from Georgia. He said he was writing a book about the criminal world of the 70s and 80s and wanted to interview Chinchlia. He offered money and guaranteed anonymity. Jalagania agreed. They met in a cafe and talked for several hours. The journalist asked questions about Zuri Batumsky, about Arsen Chkhadze, about coronations and de-coronations, about the dealings of the 90s. Chinchlia answered cautiously, naming no specific individuals, revealing no details. But he sketched out the general picture. After the meeting, the journalist vanished. The book was never published. He didn't answer calls and deleted his social media accounts. Jalagania spent a long time afterward wondering, who had that man actually been? Perhaps a real journalist who had been frightened by the potential consequences, or perhaps someone else,
gathering information for their own purposes. The meeting left an unpleasant aftertaste. Chinchlia sensed that someone was watching him, that someone was interested in his life. He became more cautious, went out less, used his phone less often, watched for signs of surveillance. He was paranoid, and that was natural. In his position, enemies could be anywhere. Old scores from the 90s, conflicts with young thieves, the interest of intelligence services. There were enough reasons for danger. In 2022, the war in Ukraine began. Poland filled with refugees. The city became loud and tense. Jalagania observed this from the sidelines, without strong emotion. War, refugees, crisis, all of it passed him by. His own war was internal. He began to prepare for the worst. He wrote a will, drew up documents for property remaining in Georgia. He composed a list of people he considered friends, though the list was short, perhaps 3 names. He recorded his memoirs on a dictaphone, several hours of narrative about his life. Not for publication, for memory, so that at least something would remain. Winter 2023 was difficult. Jalagania almost never went out. His health had finally given out. The doctors insisted on hospitalization, but he refused.
A hospital meant losing control, becoming defenseless. In his condition, that was dangerous. On what February 15th, 2023, Jalagania felt something was wrong. In the morning, an unknown number called. He answered. Silence. Then the line went dead. An hour later, another call. Again, silence. It could have been chance, but his instinct told him otherwise. He tried to reach old acquaintances, to warn them, to ask for advice. No one answered. Either they didn't want to get involved, or they couldn't. Jalagania was left alone with a danger he could feel but not name. On February 16th, he didn't sleep all night. He sat in the kitchen, drank tea, looked out the window. The street was quiet. Snow fell slowly. The city slept. Chinchlia thought about life, about how everything had turned out. Batumi, Zuri, the crown, the de-crowning, the return, the fall, the exile. The circle had closed. He regretted nothing. He had lived as he had wanted, by his own rules. Yes, he had made mistakes. Yes, he had betrayed some people, let others down. But on the whole, he had held the line, had tried to be honest with himself and with the code in which he believed. February 17th, morning. Jalagania woke late. His head was splitting. His blood pressure was through the roof. He took his pills, lay down on the sofa. He dozed off. He was woken by a knock at the door, sharp, insistent. He looked through the peephole. 2 men, faces unknown. One of them was saying something in Polish, showing documents. Possibly police, possibly not. Jalagania did not open the door. He said through the door that he was expecting no one, and that they should leave. The men stood there for another minute, then left. Chinchlia listened. He could hear them descending the staircase, leaving the building. He returned to his room, took an old pistol from the closet. He had kept it for self-defense, though he had hoped it would never be needed. He checked it. Loaded. He placed it on the table beside him, just in case. Several hours passed. Jalagania was nervous, smoking, though the doctors had forbidden it. He waited. For what exactly, he didn't know. He simply felt that something was about to happen.
In the evening, there was another knock. This time quieter, almost stealthy. Jalagania approached the door, looked through the peephole. No one. He opened it. The hallway was empty. He stepped out and looked around. Silence. He returned to the apartment, locked the door with all the bolts. The paranoia was mounting, but this was not illness. This was experience. The survival instinct that had saved him dozens of times before. What happened next is unknown. The Polish police found the body the following day, February 18th. Neighbors had called when they heard strange sounds. The apartment was in disorder, with signs of a struggle. Jalagania lay in a pool of blood, with 2 gunshot wounds to the back of the head. Beside him, his pistol, unused, which means he hadn't had time to defend himself, or hadn't wanted to. Or the killer was someone whom Chinchlia had known, and from whom he hadn't expected a threat. The investigation proceeded formally. Neighbors were questioned. They had seen nothing, heard nothing. Security camera footage was checked. There were no cameras in the stairwell, and the street cameras were too blurry to make out faces. A motive was sought. None found. The official conclusion: suicide. Absurd, but convenient. The case was closed within a week. The body was handed over to the Georgian consulate. He was buried in Tbilisi, in an ordinary cemetery, without criminal honors. About 10 people came. Distant relatives, a couple of old acquaintances. The young thieves didn't even know whose funeral it was. That was how the story of TEIMURAZ JALAGANIA ended. Without answers, without justice, without memory.
A thief-in-law, twice crowned and twice decrowned, who had passed through an entire era, died in oblivion. But his fate is more than a personal tragedy. It is a symbol of the transformation of an entire world. The criminal code, which had once been a code of honor, became an empty shell. Thieves-in-law, who had been the guardians of tradition, became businessmen and politicians. The code that had kept the criminal world in balance blurred and vanished. Chinchlia was the last of the Mohicans. He remembered the times when a thief did not work a state job, did not serve in the military, lived by honor. He witnessed those times departing, saw how the new generation spat on tradition in exchange for money. He tried to remain faithful to the old code, and he lost. His mistake was not that he was a bad thief. By the standards of his time, he was a good one. His mistake was that he could not adapt. He held on to the past when the world had moved into the future, and it was that past that destroyed him. Zuri Batumsky once said, "A thief should die standing, not on his knees." Jalagania tried. Until his last day, he did not betray his principles, did not trade his conscience, held the line. But he did not die standing. He died in a pool of blood, in a foreign country, forgotten by everyone. This is not a heroic story. It is a realistic one. The romance of the criminal life exists only in films and songs. In reality, a thief-in-law is a man who chose the criminal path and pays for that choice his entire life. With prison sentences, with betrayals, with loneliness, with a violent death. Jalagania lived 68 years. Of those, more than 50 were spent in crime. What did he get out of it? 2 years of glory after the first coronation, 10 years of humiliation after the decrowning, a few more years of authority after the second coronation, and then a long, slow fading out. Was it worth it? From a moral standpoint, no.
Jalagania destroyed other people's lives, robbed them, and possibly killed. His victims did not deserve their suffering. From the standpoint of personal choice, perhaps. He lived as he wanted, did not submit to the system, was free within his own captivity. The story of Chinchlia is a question without an answer. One can condemn him for his crimes. One can sympathize with his tragedy. One can analyze his fate as a social phenomenon. But one cannot ignore the most important thing. He was a real human being, with his own dreams, his own fears, his own mistakes. And he departed, leaving behind nothing but a legend. One that will soon be forgotten, as hundreds of other thieves have been forgotten. Because in the modern world, criminal authority figures are not heroes. They are relics of the past. The world has changed. The romance has left. Only business and violence remain. TEIMURAZ JALAGANIA, Chinchlia, the daring one. Born in 1955 in Batumi, died in 2023 in Warsaw. Between those dates lies an entire era, the era of the criminal code that was and was not. The era of people who tried to live by their own rules in a world where no rules exist. An era that ended with him.